What's going on, everybody? Coach MccDann here. When learning about all the different ways to maintain certain advantages in Smash Ultimate, there's a certain concept that seems to be overlooked by certain players. So today, we're going to go over spacing, what it is, how to apply it, and what benefits you can get when learning how to space your opponent. Typically, beginner and intermediate players fall victim to being punished for being too overly aggressive when it comes to certain players that play defensively well. One factor that makes this type of bait and punishing playstyle possible is due to overextending, something that we covered a bit in my stage control guide, definitely something you'll want to check out, but primarily consists of either an opponent missing an attack or trying to extend a combo for extra damage, only to put them in disadvantaged state. Now, given the context of the repercussions when we overextend, we're going to apply it to our lesson today with a little warm-up. Go into training mode and select Final Destination as your stage. Set a CPU to level 5 and set the CPU damage to 70%. Fix damage on and CPU behavior to CPU. And while fighting this bot for 5 to 7 minutes, try to juggle your opponent with up airs as much as possible, while always staying horizontal to them as often as you can. This will give you a better understanding of how to not overextend and stay closer to stage and advantage state. After evaluating the importance of not overextending past our opponents, only then can we finally understand a big significance that spacing your opponents brings to the table. To put it simply, spacing your opponent relies on keen positioning and movement, as well as familiarity with your character's burst range options, as it allows for a player to output an actionable move that is more difficult to punish than others, even making some moves basically unreachable and difficult to punish. Knowing this, you might be able to determine what moves are safest for your character when it comes to having good range. But if you don't, no need to worry, we're going to focus on learning more about that in this lesson today. When learning how to space opponents, it's important to recognize the situation you're getting yourself into first and foremost. If you're playing a character like Fox with minimal range, but fast aggressive options, you'll struggle most with characters that have an easier time keeping you at extremely far distances, like Min Min. So, it's important to keep in mind to think of spacing your opponent as finding a happy medium, not too far, not too close, but just right to where whiffed attacks can be punished. Spacing your opponent is done best with moves that are long range and can be used as an attack that a player can also fade back into a safe distance with. Like this example here. The whole benefit of spacing out opponents is to not get hit yourself for an action you take, but there's not one overall answer for any character as it differs throughout all the characters in Smash. So keeping that in mind, let's focus on that with our next scrim. For 3 to 5 minutes, go right back into training mode, set the CPU back to stop, and focus on performing short hop attacks with the longer range attacks your character has. With this in mind, practice trying to hit an attack, but fading back to a safe position as you do it, rather than jumping or going behind a CPU. While the advantages of spacing out your opponent can differ between each character, it's good to practice to understand why players utilize this practice regardless. It benefits to recognize when your opponent is or isn't spacing you out so you can punish or reset neutral accordingly. When keeping track of spacing, it's good to understand that the intentions behind spacing is incorporated to allow for opponents to study what options it is they want to land and attempt to force those options out of their opponents with enough patience. This is typically why you see a lot of high-level competitive sets come down to the wire so closely. So keep this in mind as you practice the concept in your own play. Make sure to play with a purpose. Speaking of purpose, now that you have a good understanding of what spacing is, play 3 to 5 games with a friend, family member, or CPU with a level you're comfortable with, and try to hold a safe distance for your opponent, and dodge as many attacks they put out as possible. The end goal of these games will not be how to win, but how to practice keeping a safe space between you and your opponent. And when the time comes, land a spaced move that you learn when they eventually whiff an attack themselves.